Oil, the lifeblood of the modern world, and it powers Alberta's economic engine. As conventional sources of petroleum are exhausted, more and more attention is being paid to unconventional sources, and Alberta's oil sands are the biggest unconventional source there is. In fact, the Athabasca Oil Sands deposit in Alberta is the largest deposit of crude oil on the planet, and its development is reshaping Alberta, Canada, and the world. But Alberta's oil sands were not always such an important resource. In fact, the development of the oil sands is only a few decades old. Before that, the history of this resource was basically a chronicle of frustrations and dead-end efforts in trying to find any value in the stuff. And the story of these efforts is a fascinating tale of speculators and schemers, scientists and surveyors, voyageurs and visionaries. The story of the oil sands begins millions of years ago at the bottom of an enormous inland sea that once covered Alberta. As organisms died, they sank to the sea floor. Over a vast period of time, the sea drained, and this slurry of dead ancient organisms was transformed by geological forces of heat and pressure into petroleum. Now today, in northern Alberta, that petroleum is found in the form of the oil sands, heavy oil mixed with sand, clay, and other minerals. The first European to visit the oil sands region was the trailblazing Peter Pond, a fur trader and map maker who opened up the fur-rich Athabasca territory in the late 1770s. A decade later, trader and explorer Sir Alexander Mackenzie noted the presence of the oil sands in his journal when he visited the area. Fur traders found oil sand handy for patching their canoes, but they viewed it more as a useful curiosity than any sort of economic resource. The view of the oil sands began to change in the last half of the 19th century as scientists from the Geological Survey of Canada began to map and inventory the nation's natural resources. When Geological Survey botanist John McCown assessed the enormous petroleum wealth of the oil sands region, he imagined a future in which present-day northern Alberta would be transformed from a desolate area into a hub of industry and commerce. Other scientists followed McCown, and while they all found the oil sands fascinating, they were preoccupied with what they thought must exist under the sands, a massive pool of oil. Test drilling by the Geological Survey of Canada revealed a massive natural gas reserve at Pelican Narrows, but no pool of liquid petroleum. Now, the dream of those vast pools of oil didn't die quickly, and in the early 20th century, as the demand for petroleum began to soar, dozens of fortune seekers made their way north in search of liquid crude. And they drilled throughout the region, but never did find the gigantic reserves they imagined. In the face of this failure, some of the more innovative oil sands pioneers tried to extract oil directly from the sands using fire and water. While these oil sands pioneers didn't find their fortune, they did manage to dispel the myth of massive pools of oil in the Athabasca region. They helped shift the focus of future research and development to the oil sands themselves, rather than what was mistakenly believed to lie beneath them. The first serious look into the economic potential of the oil sands was undertaken by Sidney Els, a scientist who was also an artist, poet, and something of a visionary. Spurred by the growing demand for petroleum, the Geological Survey of Canada sent Els into northern Alberta in 1913 to explore the oil sands. Els' first epic journey to northern Alberta convinced him of the value of the sands. Now, he determined that the best immediate use for the sands was as a paving material for Western Canada's notoriously bad roads, but he also predicted that one day a range of petroleum products would be generated from the sands. From the 1920s through the 1940s, The federal and provincial governments, along with assorted research teams and various entrepreneurs, tried to unlock the secret of the oil sands. Supported by the Alberta Council of Scientific and Industrial Research at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Dr. Carl Clark developed a hot water process to extract the petroleum from the minerals that trapped it. Others used similar techniques to separate the petroleum from the sand, including Robert Fitzsimmons at his Bitchemount plant and Max Ball at Abasand. But all their efforts were plagued by bad timing and even worse luck. Abasand on the Horse River near Fort McMurray fell victim to escalating costs and 2 fires. It was also a struggle at Bitchemount to generate profits, and the owner ultimately abandoned the venture. Meanwhile, the Social Credit Government of Alberta was accusing the federal government of sabotaging the development of the oil sands. The future of the oil sands looked bleak. The fact was, making money in the oil sands simply wasn't going to be easy. Even the most basic separation process was difficult and expensive. And then in 1947, with the discovery of the huge crude oil source at Leduc No. 1 and the subsequent discovery of several other less costly and more accessible oil reserves, interest in the oil sands declined dramatically. But the dream never disappeared entirely. Premier Ernest Manning supported research into the feasibility of oil sands development. The government of Alberta released a report asserting that the oil sands could return a profit if developed properly. The scientists met at a major conference in Edmonton and continued work on extraction processes to take oil from the sands. However, interest in commercial development was still almost non-existent. Ultimately, it would take a bold American entrepreneur to make the dream of the oil sands a reality. J. Howard Pugh, the president of the Sun Oil Company, which later became Sunoco, staked his reputation and a substantial chunk of his own money on the idea that he could succeed where so many others had failed. When Pugh's Great Canadian Oil Sands plant opened in 1967, it was a milestone in oil sands history, but it didn't resolve all of the technical issues of the oil sands development. In fact, the company would struggle through complications for years and struggle to squeeze out a profit. But it would ultimately prove that the oil sands were a paying economic prospect. In the years that followed, more oil sands plants came on stream. Newer and bigger technologies were introduced as the oil sands companies found new ways to recover the oil. Digging up the sands was no longer the only way to recover oil. By piping steam underground to liquefy the bitumen, researchers discovered that they could pump oil up to the surface. This process, known as in situ or steam-assisted gravity drainage, revolutionized oil sands operations. Every stage of the oil sands development has been marked by major challenges that have been overcome through boldness, innovation, and dedication. In recent years, the oil sands industry has focused on addressing the environmental impacts of development. It has worked to produce oil more efficiently and reduce the impact on the landscape. The oil sands in Alberta are the largest single deposit of oil in the world. They are a major provider of bitumen and synthetic crude oil to Canada and the rest of the world. The oil sands have become a driving force behind Alberta's prosperity and a major contributor to Canada's economic health. The discovery and development of this energy resource is a story of dreamers and doers, of science, industry, and government working together to overcome challenges and transform Alberta into an energy superpower. The oil sands, a big part of Alberta's energy resources heritage.